Paul Schmitz is the CEO of Leading Inside Out and Senior Advisor at FSG and the Collective Impact Forum. Paul builds the collective leadership of organizations and communities to achieve greater social impact through his roles as Senior Advisor at the Collective Impact Forum and as CEO of his consulting firm, Leading Inside Out. He's also the author of Everyone Leads, Building Leadership from the Community Up. And if you haven't read that book, you really should order it and read it. It's a really great book to read. He was the former CEO of Public Allies, where he helped more than 5,000 diverse young adults begin careers working for community and social change. Paul currently serves on the national boards of Playworks and the Corpse Network, and also serves on the board of the United Way of Greater Milwaukee and Waukesha County. He is a faculty member of the Assets-Based Community Development Institute and was a social innovation advisor to the Obama White House and has been named 3 separate years to the Nonprofit Times list of 50 most influential nonprofit leaders in America. That's pretty significant, Paul. He lives in Milwaukee, Wisconsin with his wife and his 5 children. Also very significant. Welcome, Paul.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Great to be here.
Yeah, so I'd just like to begin by doing a little bit of an introduction about yourself. How did you get started in the work of community change?
Well, my route into this work was very non-traditional. I began as a teen, and I've got an image over there. My kind of start was that picture of my driver's license. I was a kid who struggled with depression and addiction. I was institutionalized in high school. I was homeless when I was 18. I went to college through a vocational rehabilitation program. So I was someone who had been a product of social services in my life. And I ended up, by happenstance, being at a conference where I got to meet Vanessa Kirsch, who had just started this nonprofit called Public Allies, and said she was working to try and find ways to get young people who are passionate about making a difference and help them begin careers doing that, especially people who face barriers. And I said, that's exactly what I want to do. How can I do it? And she said, why don't you start one in Milwaukee? And so I got to work doing that with all the experience I had as a gardener and a telemarketer for an insurance agency. And 3 years later, became the national CEO, moved his headquarters to Milwaukee, and the rest is a little bit of history. And so Public Allies is really the place. And the thing about Public Allies is we worked in every community with young people, typically young people of color and young people from low-income backgrounds, who wanted to become leaders in their own community. And in working with that population, really building leadership from the community up in cities all over America. We were in 23 cities when I left. I think they're in 25 cities now. I got the opportunity to just really see the potential and opportunity of investing in people, and saw that great leadership was in our communities that wasn't being tapped or recognized. From there, as I got involved with Public Allies, when I went to that conference where I met Vanessa, I also met John McKnight and became a mentee of his. And he was writing a book at the time called Building Community from the Inside Out. And it just made sense to me. And I became a faculty member of the ABCD Institute, the Asset-Based Community Development Institute, back in like 96 or 97. And really that had a big influence on my way of thinking and approach to the work in terms of, again, the role of people in community as assets, and the way we think of engaging community in the work. And as we built Public Allies, one of my partners in building it was Michelle Obama. She ran the Chicago office when I ran the Milwaukee office. And as their career went in a different place, I got involved in that work, and both during the campaign and on the transition team, and then at the White House working with the Office of Social Innovation and Civic Participation. And the book that I wrote kind of holds a lot of that. And through my work now, through the Collective Impact Forum and Leading Inside Out, I'm mostly doing work with communities around collective impact and some leadership development. But a lot of it is around building the culture. How do you get people to work across difference, to have difficult conversations, to approach their work in ways that cross traditional boundaries? But what I find is that you have to be rigorous about strategy and structure, but you have to be just as rigorous about culture. And a big piece of that culture is how you engage and change power relationships. Having equity is about power. It's not just about like something you look at and analyze. It's about how do you shift power as you do this work, because that's usually the only way you get to change.
It's really interesting to me because a lot of how your journey has gone is quite similar to how Tamarack as an organization has gone, and many of the influences that we've had in our work. I mean, certainly John McKnight has been a big influence of our work. And you know, I know that you have spoken at conferences and at workshops that we have been at together. So even some of the thinking that you brought forward in Everyone Leads has been, I think, similar thinking to what how Tamarack has been based in this kind of work too. So there's lots of similarities, lots of kind of cross-sectoral pathways that we've taken.
Yeah, when I found Tamarack, when I met you all and found you all, it was a little bit of love at first sight, but it was just I felt that our approaches and ways of seeing things and all of it. So I'm very, very excited, and I think that it feels like Canada's, you know, U.S. is so large and disparate, but it feels that the community building work has even is more centered there than it is even here. And so I've always been impressed, and as I've learned about ways people are working together and things that are happening in Canada, I always think there's a lot of innovation there that I wish we had here.
So the second question that we have is, how well do you think community change makers take into account, you mentioned this notion of power, right? But how well do you think they take into account the effects of power and privilege as differentials in their work?
Not well. I think that a lot of people are afraid to dig into these conversations. I think one reason is because people want power to be a one-sum thing where people can gain more and everyone has it, but the reality is there's some win and there's some loss in it, and I think that's where people really struggle, is that you have to give up, that sharing power means not having as much power. And so I think that people who have power, like in theory sharing it and giving it up, but don't often like doing so in practice. It makes things less efficient. It means you've got to like listen more. It means you might like try and fail a few times. There's a lot involved in giving up power that's difficult. I also think that not enough people kind of test their assumptions and their beliefs when they have to do with people not like themselves. And we see that all the time in culture. We see it in so many places, but I'm always amazed at how often leaders make decisions or draw conclusions about communities they're not part of without really listening and understanding and testing that first. And so I think that there's a lot of ways it plays out, and I think in social sector work, a lot of times we're still doing work to communities rather than with communities, or really moving it to be done by community.
I think this whole notion of testing assumptions is a really interesting one, because some of us, depending on where we are, might have this assumption about power that is very negative, or interaction with power that is very negative, right? Even though we might be powerful or we might have privilege that comes in different kinds of ways, but just our orientation towards it might play a factor. So I think that assumptions piece is really important that you just raised.
Yeah, and it's all relative. Like, there's a lot of places in society where I sit as a person with immense privilege and power, but there's other tables I can go to where I have the least power and privilege, right? It's all relative. But I think it's important to own what you have and know it and not be afraid of it. But then the question is, what do you do with it? And I think that's the challenge. A lot of times with privilege, people hear condemnation, for example, of white privilege, and they feel like they're being attacked. And I think the thing is, once you acknowledge you have it, the question is, again, what do you do with it? And I think that's where people often miss that kind of step there, is that having it's not the problem, because that happened. Like, I can't change who I am. The question is, what do I do with that? Am I using that in ways that only benefit myself and my interests, or I'm using that in ways to benefit others, and especially others who don't have the same type of privilege I have?
Yeah, I think those are really important points. The third question that we have, Paul, is that it really looks at the kind of ignoring or failing to take into adequate account this notion of power and privilege, and how we, affect the outcome of our change initiatives. And so, let's probe that a little bit deeper, because you started to go there, right? In terms of thinking about, how do we, when we're working in relationship with others, how do we use this in a way that is for good versus other ways?
Yeah, and there's big blind spots so many in society have, especially those who work on policy. I had the experience of when I was working in Washington, and I'll tell the story of Newark in a moment, but when I would go to DC, my kids were in urban public schools in the US with high poverty levels. The elementary school my kids were at when I was working with the White House was over 80% free and reduced hot lunch, which is a measure the US uses to look at the amount of poverty in a school. So they were in high poverty schools, mostly children of color. And I would go to these meetings where these kind of more wonky people would be talking about what schools needed, and talking very technically about, like, if we had this, and what I recognized, frankly, just from the experience of the schools I was at, and the kids and their parents, was that the issues were way more complex and way more socioeconomical than they were about getting the right curriculum. And I would see these folks have these arguments and discussions who just had never really experienced what that means. And we see that all the time, where policy decisions get driven from the top without any real engagement or understanding of what things are like. And the most famous example, and there's a great book about this called The Prize, was in Newark, New Jersey in 2010. The mayor, Cory Booker, and the governor, Chris Christie, appeared on Oprah Winfrey with Mark Zuckerberg, who pledged $100 million to the school system there. That was matched by another $100 million from private philanthropy. And they had this big, ambitious plan with these $200 million, and the mayor worked with all these outside experts that he was bringing in, and these huge philanthropists that were supporting it, to revamp the schools. And the only thing was, the first time the Newark community heard about it was on the Oprah show. There was no engagement beforehand. There was no testing that knowledge. There was a lot of assumption built in. And what happened is the community kind of blew up over it. And there was a massive movement by citizens kind of opposing the initiative and the money and the control that had been taken out of their schools. They created a board to oversee this $200 million of funding. And I think only like one or two people lived in Newark. It was a board of mostly people from California and New York City that were making decisions about the kids in the city. And the process blew up. And it's a terrible missed opportunity. But one would think that if they had actually engaged the community on the front end and identified priorities together, and then infused money into that in an engaged process, it would have been a far more effective. Instead, it became an us and them, and it divided the city, and the level of impact was not what it could have been. And so we see that over and over again. And I think that the other thing that we have to understand, and I have another slide of another recent story, is there's always this question to me of content experts mistaking content expertise and context expertise. And it really, to me, the story recently that really hit on that was when those boys from the soccer team were trapped in that cave in Thailand, and we were all following it in the news. And Elon Musk gets involved and thinks, because he's the greatest innovator in the world, he thinks he is, and he has all these great minds, that they're going to solve it in California. So he puts his best engineers together, and they spend all this time designing a submarine to save these children, and they ship it over on a plane right away. And the people on the ground are like, that's not going to work. While the people who actually knew the area, knew the caves, and understood diving figured out a solution just by themselves that worked and saved all the boys. And then Elon Musk goes online and starts attacking them. I think he even called the diver a pedophile, which there's no basis for it. But it just shows the arrogance that often infects this work, where people think because they're experts in one thing, they're expert in other things, and they mistake the fact that they understand the technical, how things work, for understanding the context in which you place that work. A colleague of mine, Mariana Key, always says that there's those who know what and those who know how, and the know what is all the kind of explicit knowledge one might have, which again gets more to the content, and the knowing how is the people who actually understand all the implicit knowledge, all the things you can only know by doing it. And that's that context expertise. And if we're building tables to solve public problems, to me, you have to have both. And if you don't, and if you do that, you have to wrestle with power, because probably the people with more content expertise are going to have more power traditionally in the existing systems than those with context expertise. So if you bring them together, you have to figure out how you're going to share power and deal with power dynamics among them, but you need both.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you that you need both. I think you're right. I think we privilege content expertise over context expertise. But what we've seen over and over again is if we do bring the context folks to the table, they can help us with the adoption earlier, right, of these changes. And they actually, like if we tell parents, right, that if your son is 16 and needs 16 credits to graduate from high school, that parent will then, focus on that child and really try to help that child, navigate those systems. And so I think it is a balance of both. And
I would argue they may or they may not. And that's, but that's, I think sometimes we also romanticize community engagement at some level, because all of us, and I know Tamarack has experience too, has done community engagement where people haven't shown up, and where it's taken a long time to get people to show up, or it's taken time to build trust. Like, I think sometimes people are also impatient with it because they want it to be like fast and orderly, and they have a romantic notion that everyone wants to be involved, where a lot of people actually don't want to be involved, and so you just have to. I think it's just also like recognizing kind of that it's going to be work. Like, it's not just something you set a table and everyone shows up. You set a table and you have to do a lot of work to get people and get the right people, because there's lots of people with context experience. But I would say that, if we were dealing on violence in Milwaukee, where I live, and you pulled 10 people from the center of the city where the most violence is, you'd have 10 very different opinions probably on what to do. Mm-hmm. And often also think that it's a monolith, or everyone feels and thinks the same way. And so that's why you can't tokenize it, because it's really how are you capturing information, not just like how are you making even assumptions about kind of one voice being able to represent a whole community.
Yeah, David Crislip says, having the right people, as you just mentioned, with appropriate information, right? Yeah. So, and good processes. So it is that kind of mix of a couple of things, not just one thing or the other. What are some of the strategies or steps that we can take to ensure that our community initiatives are actually or actively working to balance these power dynamics?
I think the first thing is to name it. And I think so often we don't talk about it. And it's another one of those things that we think if we don't talk about it, doesn't exist. But the reality is power differentials are real. And if I'm at a table and we have the president of a community foundation and the CEO of the United Way and the president of a hospital and a mail carrier and a child care worker, there's a power, there are people at the table who have more power in our society at the table. And we need to talk about that. And you can't eliminate power imbalances. You can mitigate them. And radical transparency is one way, that if you make sure there's not a meeting before the meeting with the powerful people, that's the real meeting. If you make sure in the meetings that you're not calling on them more or privileging them in the space, that's important. And there's ways you can build a process that tries to mitigate the power imbalance by both naming it and then doing things that actually mitigate where power plays out. And power plays out often in people wield their power often behind the scenes, not at the table. So you try to mitigate the amount of behind the scenes time where power can kind of work. And that's by making sure your process is transparent and that you're naming dynamics and talking about them. And then for those of us who do have power, there's three things I really always encourage. The first is, if you have power and privilege, again, it's not like, okay, feel guilty about it and ashamed of it. Instead, ask yourself, am I hoarding it or am I transmitting it? So if I have opportunities or I get onto boards, what am I doing to make sure that I'm bringing other people along? If I get on a board that's all people who look like me, am I comfortable with that and I don't want to rock the boat? Or am I trying to get on the nominating committee and make sure there's more women and people of color coming onto that board? Am I getting opportunities to do fellowships and then recommending people in future years? Am I recommending people who are like me or people who are different than me? If I have relationships with powerful people, am I introducing them and opening doors to people who look like me or people not? So there's lots of ways you can transmit power and use the power and privilege you have to help other people gain some of that. But if you use it to kind of hold your own, then that's hoarding. I think the second thing is really about ensuring equity at the table, and that's making sure that if I'm at tables, I'm speaking up for who's not in the room and making sure that we're really being real about who we need in the room to solve problems. And the third thing is about practicing humility. That often we get to tables and our first instinct is to prove that we belong at the table by sharing all of our expertise and kind of holding all that up. And I think we often just need to ask more questions and come in with more humility and have confidence about what we bring, but humility about what we don't. And know that we have to kind of ask more and we have to be more of there's this thing about balancing advocacy and inquiry and how do we balance being curious of others' views and asking other views with kind of presenting our own, and especially drawing out and asking for opinions for people who are different than us. Or if I'm at a table and I see we're making a decision about community, no one's there, asking the question of how are we going to make sure we get to we test our ideas and test our thinking with people from that community. So I think that these are the three things that I often kind of suggest to people as a place to start in terms of thinking about how do you start to move to a place of sharing power and giving up power and kind of reconciling with your own privilege.
I think those are really great points that you raise, and just want to remind everybody who's listening in that it's a great opportunity either to share your thoughts in the chat box or to raise any questions that you might have as we're going through, because we're going to open it up for questions in a few minutes. My next question to you, Paul, is what are some of the challenges that you've noticed that initiatives have run into when they try to confront this notion of power and privilege, or these notions of power and privilege?
Yeah, I mean, I think one is thinking that it's something that can be done in a 1-hour meeting, like that isn't a process, that it's just a meeting. That thinking that what we need is a training on diversity or a training on whatever. It's about building a culture that's inclusive, that's transparent, that is that holds everyone equally accountable, that supports learning, that builds trust. And so if we focus on building the right culture, we can do that. When groups try to make it something you do on the side rather than something core to your work, that's when it doesn't work. It needs to be really seen, and people can tell when it's like real versus when it's not. And you know, I joke often, but I see these organizations and they say they share their core values, and one of their core values is diversity or diversity and equity or inclusion or some combination of those words is a core value. But you look at their annual report and the cover has photos of children, often children of color, being helped by white people, often. And then the back has a picture of their board of directors and staff, and they're all white. And that's a very visual representation that says, what it says to the community is, we don't think you have the tools to succeed. We think you need us. And we're the ones who can save this community. And that's not the intent of whoever created the annual report, but that's the story it's telling. And I see a lot of groups think again that it's about changing language or doing a training, but it's really about embracing and adopting an entire culture that seeks to do that. I heard this thing last year that it's not enough to build a inclusion. The question is, how are you actually eliminating forms of oppression in the work that you do? How are you actually undoing the inequities and not just trying to promote the positive? And again, how are you making sure that that power is being shared? And to me, that's the dirty word that people don't want to use. And again, often people want inclusion without power sharing, but it really comes down to doing the same.
It's really interesting because it's not only about having those values, but then checking yourselves all the time. How is this reflective of our values? How is this piece of work that we're going to engage in reflective of our values? Or is it? And if it isn't, how do we shift it?
I think values without accountability are just pretty words. And so it's not something that can actually guide decisions. If it's not something you refer to when you make decisions, if it's not something that people are held accountable to internally, and decisions internally are held accountable to, then they're just like nice words that people use that mean nothing. But strong cultures have values that people are accountable to, held accountable to.
Well, and they help also drive outcomes, right, for the collaborative or the organization. My next question really looks at some examples that you might be able to share where an initiative has really applied the equity lens well and has really worked hard to confront power and privilege in their work. So do you have any examples you can share?
There were three that I thought might be useful to kind of share today. That I've seen in the last couple of years that seem to be doing things that actually get at this work. The first is the Seattle Roadmap, which is a cradle to a career initiative in the Seattle region. And as I understand it, I haven't visited them, but as I've read and heard from people about it, their effort, like a lot of these, started very top down. They had a lot of, they had the Gates Foundation, they had funding and support from a lot of big institutional leaders that drove an agenda. And over time, that agenda wasn't producing equitable results. And they realized that, and they went through an equity process, and they actually on their website outlined it and share minutes from meetings and other things. It's a great resource to see what it takes to go through this. But now, as I understand, if you look at their board of directors, it's all parent residents. They've shifted the power in that effort from being the power of institutional leaders, being the ones the initiative is accountable to being parents and residents. And that's a big shift. And places that have a lot of money often aren't accountable in that way. And I thought that was a really interesting dynamic, but also because they've shared that story and put it out there, I think that's what makes it really powerful and interesting, because it really shows like how what kind of process they used to really listen to community and understand where they needed to improve, and finding that. The second example is First 5 Los Angeles, which is the county's early childhood initiative. And what I find interesting there is they have 14 Best Start communities where they are investing. And in each of those neighborhoods, they have a board that oversees the work in that neighborhood and the funding in that neighborhood. And the boards are 50% plus one parent residents. And they also have a governance rule that nothing passes the board unless both a majority of the parents and a majority of the board agree to it. And so to me, it's really an example of sharing power. But they also, and this is important, First 5 invests funds in capacity building consultants who work with those parent residents to build their skills. They're not just bringing people to the table with professionals and saying, go at it. They're actually building their knowledge and capacity, so when they come to the tables, they can feel confident and have agency and really understand the issues and dynamics and have the skills and knowledge to fully participate and lead. And so it's not just that they like create the space for people to join, they actually are training and supporting those folks so that everyone coming to the table is equipped to succeed. The third organization, the one I'm very familiar with, and the Chronicle of Philanthropy did a great cover story on them last year that they took from, it's now outside their paywall, but Lift Communities in the US was an organization that worked in many cities to work with people in poverty to help them access services better, hold services more accountable, and to find pathways out. And it was started by a young woman who, when she was a student at Yale University, and it began with the idea of having college students, often from elite schools, going and being these navigators for people who are poor. And so it began with a fairly elite premise and leadership of kind of these Ivy League young people coming in and trying to help poor people escape poverty. As they evolved and grew, they began diversifying more, but they hit a point where the CEO realized that it just wasn't right. The dynamics inside the organization weren't matching those outside. And she hired a consultant to do an assessment inside the organization and found that, like the people of color who worked, they weren't happy, that they weren't really fully accountable. And they went through this incredible process that, and the CEO really leading the whole way with incredible vulnerability and openness, that led to an organizational shift where in the course of like a few years, they went from a staff that was predominantly white to a staff that was predominantly people of color, that their staff was much more reflective and representative of the neighborhoods and communities they were serving, that their recorded impact doubled while they did this. And they found all these ways that having that more diversity at the table, having people who are closer and from those communities, brought better ideas and better solutions and better work. And Kirsten Lodel, their founder and CEO, just stepped down recently. She's one of the young leaders I most admire in the U.S., but was succeeded by an African-American woman. It was almost a complete shift, and there's a lot more to that story and how they work with their board and their staff. But as it accelerated, people saw the impact that changed when they changed. But and I think this is the key thing, is that to change who was at the table, they had to change the table. So the focus wasn't, we're going to get diverse people and then build an inclusive culture. They first focused on really building the inclusive culture, and then it became a self-reinforcing cycle as they brought people in, that it was much easier and much more attractive to people. And then they found they had no problem getting just incredible talent from the communities they were serving once they were seen as a place that actually took care of talent. And so those are three that I found kind of interesting in each of those dynamics. And each of them have case studies and things they've written about this work. The Lift one and the Chronicle of Philanthropy, and I think the other two have them on their websites. But I think are great examples of groups that have looked at how do we share and shift power and not kind of follow the traditional paradigm of powerful people in a city making decisions for communities.
Really, really interesting examples, and all they're similar, but they have nuances, right, that make them kind of unique and different kinds of approaches. I've got two questions, one that we've agreed to, and then one I'm just going to surprise you with. Right. So be prepared. The one we've agreed to, what's the bottom line principle that you can share that will help us frame our own efforts to genuinely be inclusive?
I kind of go back to those three things I shared earlier about, transmit and don't hoard power, use your power to support others, ensure that there's equity at your table. And there I have a graphic I often use, but I ask people to imagine if the intended beneficiaries of your work and the neighborhoods you serve and the issues that they're facing were at the center of your table, to ask yourselves how many people at our table that are making decisions live in the neighborhoods we're serving. How many of us even have family members who live there or have lived there? How reflective is our table of the community we're serving and the population specifically we're serving? Not the giant, but who specifically are we trying to help? And are we reflective of them? Does our table have the same kinds of demographics of the people we're trying to help? Do we have people who come from other marginalized populations? Do we have anyone with lived experience on the issues we're working with at the table? Or even who have family members with lived experience? And what I find is when we have people, when we have a mix of people that includes folks with lived experience who are representative of communities, who live in communities or have lived there, and we have people who have that kind of skin in the game and that connection, we have better information about the people, the community, and the issues. We have that context expertise that when we add it to the content expertise allows us to be more successful. So this ensuring equity at the table is really about making sure we ask ourselves that. And then that final thing about, bringing humility to communities, not coming in as saviors, not coming in as know-it-alls, but coming in with that humility to ask more questions and seek to understand first versus to be understood. And I think if we come in with that notion, we start to create a space where we say, okay, I'm going to make sure the right people are at tables, and I'm going to advocate for new people to be at tables. I'm going to use my power to help others. And I'm going to just really be in a place of inquiry and humility when I join communities and enter communities. If you do those things alone, it can make a big difference.
I think those are really good points. The question that I'm going to surprise you with is, so our title of this workshop or this webinar is Power, Leadership, and Community, Common Ground or Crisis. If I were to ask you, just kind of observing over the last number of years that you've been engaged in this work, do you think we are closer to common ground or are we closer to crisis?
Wow, there's a couple levels of that, right? So I would say in America, we're in a crisis. We are highly divided, and that those divisions are getting deeper and steeper and more, they're becoming stronger, not weaker, the divisions. And so as a result of that, at a kind of macro level, we have a challenge in terms of engagement. And then we move to the community level where people are actually working to solve problems. And I actually think that there's a mix of things happening. I still think we have got a long way to go. But about 5 years ago, I started hearing more and more foundations and others use the language of equity, which is a far more radical notion than inclusion or even equality, because it recognizes that we have to differentially invest to get people to similar results, that we have to sometimes shift power, and that there's sometimes winning and losing along the way. I think an equality frame was an everyone wins notion, and equity frame notices that a lot of things are zero sum, and we've got to actually divert resources from some groups to others to get everyone to the same result. I noticed more and more about 5 or 6 years ago, I started hearing that more, but I still felt people were talking about out here, they were talking about equity in terms of disaggregating data, understanding disparities and differentiating the work, but they weren't talking about it with themselves. They weren't talking about who were at their tables and how they were changing, who they hired, who they engaged, what communities they consulted. I'm now seeing that start, which gives me more hope. I'm seeing more and more conversations about equity in the space of representation instead of just the space of outcomes. I often use the metaphors that an equity lens is the way that we look at data and disaggregate and plan programs, and equity mirrors how we look at ourselves and ask ourselves, who's at our tables, who's making decisions, do we really have the best information, and are we making decisions equitably? I would say you can't do equity unless you try to be equity, which is really the key there. And so for me, that I see a mixed bag overall of, I think we're making progress, but I also think we're seeing a lot of pushback as well. So my hope is that, because I'm an optimist at heart, is that we're moving closer to community than crisis, but it definitely feels a little bit more crisis right now.
And I think, it's really context, right? And I think what you shared is really, at a national level, what's the context? And then as we're trying to do this work locally, what's the context? But I think, thinking about it as potentially, if we have this notion that we do want to have this equity lens and this equity mirror that we're sharing, then we have to actually move forward on it in a way that, reflects kind of our own values, but then also has us asking some of those gut check questions that you've raised, right? And approaching it all with humility, right? That being silent before we speak. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Duncan, who is going to share a couple of questions with you that we've received from our listeners in the audience.
Great.
All right, thank you so much, Paul, for sharing that with us. Our first question is from Rachel, and she asks, how have you seen funding and funding inputs shape the culture of collaborations in this context?
Yeah. So I've got a case study I'm about to publish that's really interesting, of a foundation in my state in Wisconsin. It was a health foundation that made 8-year-long grants in groups to move their collaborative work around behavioral health. They gave them to 10 coalitions across the state working on behavioral health, and I think at a range of like 200 a year US dollars per community per year for 8 years. On top of that, they have a learning community. The first year they met every month, and now every quarter. They sponsor a conference that the learning community puts on for the field in the state. They have a research institute from a university that's been hired to do all their research, all their evaluation, to help them find evidence-based programs, et cetera. And they also have a capacity building pool they can apply to for funding for things like board development funding, fundraising skills, policy advocacy skills, and other things. And I think it's the most humane funding stream I've seen as a funder trying to really establish trust and engagement. I also think, the work of the Ford Foundation right now and really trying to use their prominence to really push an agenda of what does it mean to invest general operating dollars in organizations over longer periods of time has been really welcome. And I've seen other funders at a local level start to think about kind of how to form more partnerships. And again, not to wield their power over their grantees, but really see grantees as partners in solving problems together. And I think that's really the model that we most need is where funders and organizations are partnered, and it's not foundations using their power in ways that actually often prevent collaboration, that they sit at a table, but then they still make backroom deals to fund the organizations they're closest with or have the most legacy with, or they see a community collaborating to develop a plan and they still issue an RFP based on things that aren't in that plan. I think that I'm seeing more and more funders willing to partner in that way. Not enough yet. That's an area we need more of. But again, I'm hopeful that I'm seeing models emerge of longer term support, more partnership, more transparency, and the ability of grantees to be vulnerable with their funders and talk about what they're doing and where they're struggling and not feel they're going to lose the grant, and really creating a space where people can work together in the adaptive way that really is needed to solve problems, instead of on 2 or 3 year grant cycles where you're worried about getting a renewal and you can't show that you're failing or struggling or you have to start over with something. I think that we're seeing more options like that, but boy, we need a lot more.
Oh, thank you so much, Paul. Our next question is one that a couple of people have brought up. It goes back to your conversation around making sure that the right people are at the table. And in contexts where, community change roundtables have been exclusive and have excluded voices with lived experience, in order to rectify that, how would you approach building trust with those communities that this time when we're asking for input or ownership over the problem, that they will actually be listened to? How do you build trust despite a history of exclusivity?
I think the best way to learn about it is to read books about divorce. And I'm teasing, but there's these. But a lot of psychologists have helped us understand how you build and repair trust, and it often has to do with radical transparency and over overproducing on promises, not underproducing. And so I think the first thing is always set expectations and make commitments that you will truly be accountable for and meet. Overproducing on those commitments in the sense of trying to always do more and be earlier with what you promise to community. That there's not mystery in how decisions are being made or things they feel they've done that have kind of went away or been overridden without clear expectation that maybe they don't have as much influence, or communication about why and how that explains the logic by which things shifted. And so for me, the key is that transparency, that accountability, and as I said, in a way, one of the ways you can rebuild trust or repair it is, as I said, really overdoing it in a way in terms of like that they're always getting information on time, they're always getting more, they're always being engaged more, that they see really very specifically that the ways that they're being helped and supported, that you really mean it, that you're really going to come through for them. I think the other thing is that there's times when there's values decisions that will be made where the interests of more powerful folks and the interests of community come into conflict. And the question is, at those points, where do you come down and how do you navigate and negotiate that? And that's going to tell people a lot about what they can trust. And sometimes we make the decision that actually the right decisions, what other leaders, but then we have to, again, be really transparent about the logic and help people see that and understand that. But I think it's really never overpromise, especially on the level of engagement. Set clear expectations and always exceed them, and be radically transparent with them along the way.
One of the things that this whole conversation has reminded me of is that I heard someone recently say, lived experience, but what about living experience, right? And I thought that was a really interesting nuance that they brought to this conversation, to think about both of those contexts as we're engaging people, right? Not only people with lived experience, but also people with living experience, and what does that mean and what's the difference? So just as we were chatting, I was thinking that that's just something that I've been chewing on in my brain a little bit since that conversation, and one that I think is important to raise, in the context of what we've been chatting about today as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have just time for one quick answer to this question, but I think it's a question worth addressing. It comes from Jackie, and Jackie says, conversations about power dynamics take courage. For those of us working in communities that may not be ready to confront their power dynamics, are there any baby steps leaders can take to support readiness?
Wow, yeah, that's a great question. It does take courage. I'm conflict avoidant by kind of nature, so this stuff I don't at all pretend any of this is easy. It is difficult to take it on, but again, I think that those, an important thing is to find those allies who have power, who are willing to model the way and to hold the space for others. I think that in terms of baby steps, I think just one of the things that that I wrote about in another article was about, like, often when we first engage communities in our work, they don't come in happy. And I think people often think that, oh, hey, now we're finally doing this initiative, we're going to invite all these residents to this event, and we expect them to come with gratitude that we finally invited them, when in fact they often come kind of pissed that they haven't. How have you done all this work without us for years? And I think sometimes you have to allow people to vent. You have to allow people to say the wrong things. You have to allow people to, you have to kind of recognize that there needs to be a space for some messiness up front. But if you stick with people and you don't freak out at it and you stay connected to it, that people start to build trust that if they keep coming back, they'll be listened to. And a lot of times those early ventings are almost tests to see if you're really real or if you're going to kind of push people aside. So I think just creating space for the conversations. And then I think really building relationships is always the center of this work. And we always forget that, like, rooms filled with people don't build relationships. Discussions, one-on-one, small meetings build it. And so how are we orienting and building trust and building relationships? I don't know necessarily how to kind of help people build courage other than to model things and create space for it, and for people to see that others took courageous stances and actually succeeded and got what they needed, or changed the debate, or moved something different. And so I think finding people who've done that and creating space for it in meetings and shaping a path for it are important. But it's a great question, and courage is definitely a big piece of it once you get in that space. And those of us who are trying to navigate between those with more formal power and those without, that is a courageous space to be. It's hard because you may no longer be invited to a table that you were at because of pushing for it. And everyone else is still invited to that table and you're not, because you raised the questions. And you have to be willing to, again, possibly lose, which takes some courage. But I think that, again, it matters. I coach. I have some coaching clients, and just one quick last story, which is one of my clients is the CEO of a community foundation in a smaller city, and she was at a public event, and there was a donor who was one of the biggest donors to the community foundation said something really offensive to a community member, an African American man, and she called him on it on the spot. And actually it created a problem that went all the way up to her board, because he complained to the board about her behavior, and the board ended up sticking with her. But not only that, but the community, the story got out, and people, they were trying to really build their community engagement, and the number of people showed up at meetings and believed in them was far higher because she took a risk. And she made a value decision to stand up with courage at a point that would have been easier to try and be more polite to the donor. But no, she called the donor out and made clear that it was really offensive and wrong, at risk to her giving. But what she got in return was way more. And so I think finding those stories of people who've taken risks and used their courage and seen a reward to impact, to community, to the number of people engaged, can help other people who are trying to navigate that space have more courage.
Oh, that's perfect. Thank you, Paul, for sharing that. We are at time, so I just wanted to thank both you and Liz for sharing with us. I think the conversation has been really constructive. This is such a powerful topic to discuss, and I feel that both of your comments were very valuable. We do have a couple quick learning opportunities I'd like to share with everyone on the call. The first is Citizens at the Center, a community engagement thought leader series. You can join us at Citizens at the Center to fill your community engagement toolkit with new and innovative methods to engage and empower ordinary citizens in your community change work. Tamarack will be joined by Australian citizen engagement expert Max Hardy for this series of one-day workshops taking place May 1st to 7th all across Canada. We also have an asset-based community development event ABCD Healthy Neighborhoods, Healthy Cities, where you can join 7 of the world's top authors and practitioners in the field and over 250 community and neighborhood development practitioners in Edmonton, Alberta, to explore the use of asset-based community development and explore leading neighborhood revitalization techniques. Our final event is Evaluation and Design. This is a 2-day workshop designed to help you integrate innovation and design techniques with developmental evaluation. By combining both design and evaluation techniques, you'll return to your organization with a diverse toolkit that will boost your capacity to drive and evaluate changes to the systems that form the base of complex community challenges. This event features Mark Kabaj, Galen McCluskey, and a special guest address from evaluation pioneer Michael Quinn Patton. And this runs from May 22nd to 23rd in Ottawa, Ontario. In the next day, you'll receive a follow-up email, which will include a link to the full recording of today's call, as well as the learning opportunities I've just mentioned. And a couple of people have reached out to ask about links to the case studies that Paul mentioned. We'll be including those as well. To learn more about upcoming learning opportunities, including workshops and free webinars like this one, you can visit us at tamarackcommunity.ca. We also encourage you to take a minute to complete a short webinar survey to offer some feedback on how you enjoyed today's call. The link will be on your screen and will also be sent out to your email. Thanks again, everyone, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everyone. Great to be with all of you.